Welcome back to Benny's Custom Works. Today we're on the IS200. So far this project's been a bit of a flop. We're waiting on parts for two separate jobs. We've already started on this. So I thought, why not pull it apart more? So we're going to pull the box out and chuck our new clutch in, which I'm sure is going to go super smoothly. So watch this space and see how badly we can train wreck this one as well. Hey. Oh good, more aftermarket wiring. I love that. I have no idea how this console comes out. Must be something to do with this cup holder. Floor mats, we need floor mats in a drift car. That clutch is sweet. On this particular vehicle, the spigot bearings actually collapsed and it's just totally like sort of exploded in the back of the crank. It hasn't caused any permanent damage, but obviously the bearings come apart and you can't use the normal like paper mache and punch it out type trick. So I've got a pilot bearing remover here, which is like a 3-jaw puller that actually sits on the back of the crank. It's a pretty cool little tool. It's a bit specialty. I mean, you probably wouldn't have one at home. I've probably only used it 3 or 4 times, but it's very handy for this sort of thing, pulling out spigot bearings out of the back of the crank or other bearings that are in blind holes. So it helps you get them out pretty quick. And you just wind it out. And it falls out like that. Nearly smacks you in the face. SparesBox were kind enough to send us this exceeded clutch kit. It's actually a dual mass delete kit, so it's a solid flywheel with a clutch. Also hoping there's a spigot bearing in there, but if not, we'll quickly run down to the bearing shop and pick one up. So this is the exceeded kit. Pretty big thing. Oh, look at that. Spigot bearing, alignment tool, flywheel bolts, a little bit of grease for the input shaft and a dowel pin and a sheet of stickers and lots of memos. Oh nice, it's a heavy duty one. Sweet, I didn't even order that, it hooked me up. When you get any new clutch or brake components, it's pretty important to actually give them a good clean down before you use them. Generally they coat them with some sort of like light oil or even just oil from machinery or in the manufacturing process. So obviously anything braking or anything clutch, friction's pretty important in the operation of the assembly. So pays dividends to give it a good wipe down with some brake cleaner. It's important to give it a really good clean, otherwise you can have premature clutch failure. Same with the cover. Once we take the plastic off it, we'll give it a good spray and a wipe down and should avoid any future problems. So this is the new spigot bearing, and this is what's left of the old one. It's pretty important that you do have a fully operational spigot bearing, otherwise you can have a lot of input shaft bearing wear, or even worse, it can damage the input shaft. The job of the spigot bearing is really to align the input shaft first and foremost, but also to support it when you've got your foot on the clutch. It allows it to spin without dragging. And then obviously when you're off the clutch, it basically locks the input shaft to the flywheel and to the crank. So then this bearing actually spins at the same speed on the outside and the inside of the race. But the second you put your foot on the clutch, if the box is in gear, the input shaft no longer spins, but the outside of the bearing will spin. So basically means that you've got broken drive. If there was no bearing there, or if it was a solid mount, obviously that'd completely sort of cancel out the operation of the clutch and it would try and drive through that bearing. Same problem if you do have a seized or a sticky spigot bearing or a spigot bush, it can actually still try and drive through that bush because it'll drag. And then if that does happen, you'll find that it'll wear the front or the nose of the input shaft out. And generally the only way to repair that is to actually replace the input shaft. Or in some instances you can actually machine it down and put an odd sized bearing in, but more often than not it does involve replacing the input shaft. So be very mindful when you change your clutch every time to put a new spigot bearing in. Pretty important to lubricate the clutch fork and everything inside the bell housing while you're in there. One thing to keep in mind though is to use any lubricant sparingly, because any excess lubricant will probably end up on the clutch, and that's definitely going to lead to premature clutch failure. So any grease you put in, make sure you just do the smallest film. Like if you have a close look here, there's only very small sort of film on the fork. We're not looking at big build up anywhere. Even in the back of the pivot where I know it's never going to get to the clutch, it's still just a light film. Because the other thing is too, any clutch dust will build up in the grease. So the less grease you've got, the less chance you've got of clutch dust build up, which will also lead to premature failure of other components. Oh, dangling thing. All in all, we've had a pretty successful day. The day hasn't at all gone to plan, but that's what happens sometimes with project cars. We've checked a few things out. We've realised that some of the parts we've already got are actually wrong, so I've ordered some stuff from Sydney. I've got to go and pick that up in the morning. Other than that, pretty happy. We did the clutch as well, which has now got a solid flywheel in it instead of the dual mass flywheel it used to have. Looking at the clutch that came out of it, was definitely due to be replaced. So pretty happy we've done that now instead of going to an event and killing it then. So we'll head home now because it's dark and back here tomorrow for day 2. This method's not advisable to remove drive shafts if you want to use them again, because it's definitely going to mushroom the end of this shaft. But because we're never going to use these F-Series shafts again, I'm just going to give them a good old flog with a hammer, because I actually need to reuse the nuts that go and hold these axles in, but the axles we don't need to reuse, so that'll be the sacrificial part today. But hopefully someone can still use them down the line, but they shouldn't be too badly damaged. You should be able to repair it, so we'll see what happens anyway. Oh, winner! One hit and it's out. That never happens. Wow, this thing has some useless under trays. They're definitely going in the bin. You may be slightly horrified at the holes I've just smashed into the spare wheel well, but the truth of it is we're probably going to cut that out at a later date anyway and put an exhaust or some sort of diffuser or something in there. Being also that it's a stat write-off, I'm not too particularly attached to the sheet metal of the car, so we can afford to smash some holes in it here and there. If you were going to do this on a nice street car, I'd probably recommend just to unbolt the subframe and drop it down a bit. Then you can easily get to the bolts to hold the back hat in. But being that this is going to be a motorsport car also, it's going to be nice and easy to be able to access that stuff quickly if we do have to pull diffs out or whatever. So having those holes there means we can just go in and out as we please without having to have weird tools or having sore wrists for 10 hours or whatever. So a couple of quick hole saws and off we go. So there's 2 access points vertically and 2 horizontally now, so we can get to all the diff bolts easily. So we've now undone all the rear cover bolts. So I'll go up, undo the drive shafts, undo the tail shaft, then undo the front ones, and then that means the diff will just drop straight out the bottom. $10 says this bolt's gonna round. Is it bad when you're betting on damaging your own car? Oh, yes, I won $10. One drive shaft. Huh. Oh, no. Interesting. More wrong parts. Yesterday didn't go to plan at all. We had so many parts that weren't working properly or were actually the wrong thing, or the internet told us it would work and it hasn't. So we basically scrapped our whole rear end plan from yesterday. It's about 11:30 in the morning. I've actually already been to Sydney and come back, which is about a 2.5 hour drive round trip. We've got all new rear end parts. Triple S hooked us up, thanks to those guys. So we've got a whole JZX100 chaser cradle. And from that, we're going to use the CVs, the inner and outer CV and the drive shaft as an assembly. And we're also going to use these drive flanges. So the ones we had yesterday, although everyone said that the IS200 diff was a G series, it is actually still an F series diff. So these flanges didn't fit into our G-Series diff from a BRZ. So we've then gone up this morning, grabbed all this. I've already stripped the cradle. We've pulled everything apart. So these flanges do fit in our diff. I've already dummy checked them. I've also checked our drive shafts for length and also the outer spline, and they fit straight into the IS200 outer hubs. So anyone that wants to put a G-Series into a IS200, JZX100 stuff is a winner. With a lot of these IRS style diffs, they've got either a filler plug in the side or in the back cover. It's a good idea to actually crack the filler plug before you put the stub shafts in, because if for whatever reason you can't actually undo that, you can fill it through the stub shaft hole. The level's not going to be exactly right, but in this case, it's probably actually better to have too much oil than not enough. You can be caught out otherwise trying to, especially if you put this in the car too, that's another thing. Try and loosen these before you actually attempt to fit it, because a lot of the times, Nissans are actually really bad for it. Sometimes they're like the filler plug's up here and it's right in the subframe, and it can be quite hard to undo it. They're not too bad to tighten up because you really only need to nip them up by hand. But for some reason, people in Japan like to hang off them with like 20-foot breaker bars and stuff, so they're in there for good. But yeah, handy little tip, crack the filler plug before you fit it. And on the back of that, if you can't get the filler plug out, you can fill it through the stub shaft hole. Luckily, our one's loose. The first part of the process of putting the whole rear end back together is putting the drive shafts in. I like to lubricate the splines before we assemble everything, because if I have to pull this apart, or even if the next person has to pull these apart again, it's going to be a lot more chance these will come out freely. The rear end we actually got today, one of the shafts was stuck in it, so I had to sort of mushroom the end of the shaft getting it out. I've repaired that now, it's all good. But yeah, handy tip is some anti-seize, or if you don't have anti-seize, even just a good quality wheel bearing grease. You don't have to use a lot of it either, just thin sort of brush on or wipe on and you're good to go.
Pump up the jam, pump it up.
No. So this is a aftermarket sway bar that I've got. This is a TRD sway bar. That's about it for the driveline upgrades on the IS200 today. We've gone the Exceedi Sports Tough clutch up front with a solid flywheel. Down the back, we've gone the diff upgrade, the 4.3 BRZ G-Series diff. Then we've got JZX100 stub shafts and drive shafts. So that gets us sorted. Thanks again to Triple S for sorting us out with the JZX100 parts. And also thank you to SparesBox for the clutch. And some really exciting news, SparesBox have actually got a Skidpan coming up on August 8th at Sydney Motorsport Park. We're going to be there with the IS200. We're also going to have the Stager there on display. And it's actually our last event before we go to Drag Week in the States, so I hope to see you guys there. Catch you next time.